We're starting part three of the 1980s with the Jean-Paul Gaultier. And this part three is going to focus on the European designers because they're worlds apart from what the Japanese designers are doing. Even if they're located in Paris, they're miles away aesthetically from what they're doing, what the European designers are doing. So you're looking at Jean-Paul Gaultier on the left. He was always called the bad boy of fashion, and he was always breaking all the rules. And it's really hard to define his career because he did so many incredibly wild, wondrous things. One of the things he's responsible for, as you see on the right, is putting men in skirts. I'm only going to give you a couple of slides of Gaultier's work, but this is probably his very most iconic piece, and Madonna wore it on tour. It was this, this corset dress, and he took the breasts and made them these giant pointed cones. He did a whole line in '84 with these sort of laced up, almost corset-like evening wear pieces. He worked with both Patou and Pierre Cardin, so he had a lot of haute couture props and was a really marvelous designer who we're not going to go too far into because we have a lot of other people to talk about. If you look at Thierry Mugler's looks, he is like hyper ultra feminine. And hopefully you're going to look at these and say, maybe a little 1950s flavor here, because think of the new look with the pinched in waist and then the wide hips. Very feminine. Look at this bright, punchy color, because this is sort of the status quo of the 1980s. The Japanese are the radical fashion of the 1980s. But what you usually are seeing are these really brightly colored, form-fitting garments for women. So Thierry Mugler was the ultimate fantasist. He would make these, as I mentioned, hyper feminine looking garments, really like form-fitting to the female body, but complete fantasy land, fairy tale, futurism. He made one dress that actually had the handlebars of a motorcycle coming out of it, and another one that featured sort of paillettes that were insect-like. So he's on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of extreme fantasy and futurism. He's a 10. Claude Montana was another important French designer, very popular, loved leather. If you look at this, you should be able to say, oh, this is 1980s. Look at those giant shoulders. I mean, we saw big shoulders in the 40s, but remember they were very sharp, and they wouldn't have been wearing maxi coats with leather pants, correct? So we've introduced Yves Saint Laurent to you much earlier, back in the 1950s when he worked for Christian Dior. But I just wanted to let you know that he continues designing for decades. And here he is in the 80s, still using artists' work and directly applying it into his garments. So embroidered with like couture embroidery on these runway looks. So Yves Saint Laurent continues to get inspiration from the Far East and Northern Africa or Russia. He goes far afield to get his inspiration. So on the right, you have a evening ensemble that's inspired by Chinese garments, and on the left, this is from the late 70s. It's inspired by a Russian peasant dress. I've included the slide of an opium perfume ad with Linda Evangelista in it from 1988, not because he created his very successful perfume Opium then, it was launched much earlier, but because Linda Evangelista is wearing a garment that we have in the Fashion and Textiles collection. And if we were in situ, I would be showing it to you. It has very, very sharp shoulders, and it's extremely luxe, and I wish I could show it to you. Karl Lagerfeld comes to Chanel in 1983. And what Karl Lagerfeld does is all he does is rehash and redo the House of Chanel. So on the left, you see a very famous photo of her with her pearls draped and behind her neck. And he actually made the dress on the right in the 1980s that features a bunch of necklaces, but they're actually sewn into the garment. So everything's a tribute to Coco. He also continues to remake the Chanel suit that you see on the left and in the middle over and over and over again, all these different variations. But as in the case in the middle, sometimes he verges into what I call granny chic, which is extremely unpleasant and not very satisfying. Christian Lacroix starts his line really late. It's like 1987 when he starts his line, but he's full force in the 1980s, and you can see it here. Look at the punchy color. Look at the exaggerated shapes. So Lacroix's aesthetic is, as I mentioned, deeply embedded in the 1980s, even though he continues into the 1990s. And that historicism and retro looks that I've mentioned, you can really see at play in his works. So on the left here, we see a bouffant, like a 1950s/60s bouffant crinoline skirt, complete with a stole. Remember a stole that you wrap around your shoulders? And a beehive hairdo. And also we saw these sort of gathered and tucked bubble dresses like the one on the right as far back as, Balenciaga in the late 50s. So this is the last Lacroix I'm going to show you, but I mean, excess exaggeration. Do you see how ginormous this puffball of a skirt is? Okay, it's got 1980s written all over it. I'm just briefly going to talk about Emmanuel Ungaro, who just passed away recently. Um, Emmanuel Ungaro actually worked with Balenciaga for about 10 years. So he studied under the great master, and he had all of his couture chops down. On the left, of course, you can see Cameron Diaz in 2002 in this gorgeous, beautiful evening wear, red carpet look. But on the right, I inserted this because that pink garment you see on the right is almost identical to pieces we have in the collection. So we have about 4 or 5 of them, and with the hugely broad shoulders and then draped into the waist.